Stromquist, principal at Lanstrom Advisors. Albert, there's clearly a number of headlines that one could pick on, but I think I'd start with the more macro that we had China's premier yesterday, Premier Li Qiang, if I know if I pronounce his name right, but he's issued what would be his third warning about economic growth outlook in China, his third warning in a week. Not often the Chinese leadership is that transparent about weakness in the economic outlook. Your thoughts on where things are at the moment in China?
Well, it's the outlook, Sean, has certainly been softening from a more relatively bullish forecast of 6% growth, which was kind of the last guidance before yesterday from Li Qiang. The consensus of economists from the private sector pegs the annual growth forecast at about 5% per year, and there are outliers to that as well. Goldman Sachs, for example, is looking at 4.6%, and they're staying with that number for now. Look, that translates into a loss of energy demand that you have correctly put that at about 1 million barrels a day, seeing a little stronger figures, but that's a significant drop, and that in turn has carried over into the refining sector, right? Where China has consistently been a strong exporter of transportation fuels to Asia, and is now restricting its export of transportation fuels to meet the remaining domestic demand for jet, automotive, and diesel. That is compounded by the plight of the independent refiners in Shandong, who have traditionally been dependent on Russian crude oil imports for at least 20% of their feedstock. They are now no longer able to procure those Russian deliveries. And as a result, the refining utilization in the private sector now is put at about something like 57%, right? Which means that margins are squeezed, and in the case of some of those refiners, even negative. So there is a sea change in the fuel demand side here in China, and the response of the government and industry to that.
I think, as we talked about there, the unknown as to how much Russian oil gets disrupted. The counter unknown, Albert, is how much of demand destruction we have in China. Nomura Holdings, so it was a mention there of Goldman Sachs and others. Nomura economist, as reported in Bloomberg, said that the risk of recession is rising in China, estimating that now, because a lot of the reporting has been focused on Shanghai, but there's actually over 370 million people in 45 cities now under full or partial lockdown in China, which accounts to close to 40% of China's GDP. This is a massive disruption if it's sustained. Looking beyond Shanghai, Albert, how big a challenge is this?
Well, that's the other side of the story that's not getting sufficient attention today. I'm glad you raised that, Sean. But the response of the government to Shanghai, to the cluster in Shanghai, has been brute force, and it has had a ripple effect around the country. While reporting is repressed, there is still information that leaks out by word of mouth to the rest of the population. And the reports are that the population of China, the people outside of these quarantine cities, are scared. They're scared by what they see in Shanghai. They're scared that they're going to become victims, as the Shanghai people have been, should infection clusters pop up in their own communities. And nowhere in China is safe today. Right? Even here in Hainan Island, the city of Sanya has been shut for a week, the entire city. Right? The city of Lingshui in central Hainan. So it's occurring around me as well, so I can feel the direct consequences of it, understand the sentiment of the population here in China. That has to, and should the virus continue to propagate, and it seems like for all practical purposes, it's become endemic now in the population in China. Should it continue to propagate and the government continue to assert the same level of forceful or brute response to it, yes, the impact on the economy is going to be far more severe than what's been predicted so far, with the attendant further deeper erosion of energy demand and economic output and trade and supply chains.
We did see overnight reporting, Albert, that in the context of Shanghai, that actually there was some level of social unrest, shops being broken into, food security issues emerging. And we had noted a few weeks ago in college campuses some demonstrations against this approach. Is that a tangible sentiment, do you feel, the reporting out of Shanghai?
Apparently the delivery of aid to the population in Shanghai has been uneven. Why would you expect anything different in a city of 26 million people? And the result has been that some districts have experienced deep food shortages and hunger, attendant hunger. And I think what we saw on Sky News yesterday and other news services and again today was the just kind of the violent reaction of the people to being pushed to a red line where enough was enough, right? They needed food, they needed medication, they needed relief. So I think today the latest announcement here from Beijing is an attempt to back off of the citywide quarantine to allow districts with relatively few or no active cases of the virus to begin to open up to a more normal lifestyle, while the city focuses on those areas that are still hot. So that's a small baby step toward addressing the sentiment of the people. Remains to be seen now whether that direction will continue in terms of the government's policy toward treatment of the pandemic.
Do you think there's anything that, I mean, we saw today supposedly in Shanghai a shifting of the zero tolerance, given that they're allowing people out on the streets, at least in some instances, but there's still a very, within China context, a very high infection rate in Shanghai. Do you think there's any potential that this zero COVID could crack before the end of the year and the Communist Party meeting?
Could crack in what sense, Sean?
Well, I mean, in the sense that it could be abandoned, this policy to maintain zero COVID.
Well, no, I don't see the policy, this dynamic zero policy, facing that outcome this year. I think it's too important to the social stability that's required leading up to the party conference in October. And any U-turn that may be on the horizon through a large infusion of capital from the government, look, that would be predicated on achieving success in this dynamic zero with this dynamic zero policy. And given the kind of the rate of propagation of the virus now here in China, I think the view here from April is that the rest of the year is going to be fairly bearish for the government and for the economy.